On the morning of May 19th, 1536, the Tower of London was silent. The river no longer glittered with golden barges or echoing cheers. It only carried the sound of oars slicing through the water and the faint tolling of bells. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, who had once entered the tower in triumph, was returning to it as a prisoner, and within a few hours, her head would fall into a bed of straw. But what the world did not know then, and what still chills the imagination nearly 5 centuries later, is what happened after. Her death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one of the most haunting afterlives in royal history, a tale of power, erasure, and the grotesque ways a kingdom tried to bury both a woman and her memory. The execution itself was supposed to be quick, merciful, almost graceful. A French swordsman, specially brought from Calais, stood ready with a blade so sharp it could slice through air without sound. Anne had chosen the sword over the axe, a privilege rarely granted to English traitors. But mercy in Tudor England was a cruel illusion. One swing separated her head from her body, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Blood burst upward, staining the straw, and then silence. The queen who had once changed the faith of a nation was reduced to flesh cooling in the morning sun. No one bowed. No priest stepped forward. There was no coffin, no anthem, no marble tomb. Just the smell of iron and the whisper of disbelief. That is where history books tend to stop. Neat and tidy, as though death tied up the story. But Anne's head did not vanish into myth that morning. It was picked up, handled by shaking hands, examined like an object, and finally shoved into a wooden chest meant for arrows. Because no one had bothered to prepare a proper coffin, her legs were folded, her body pressed down until the lid barely closed. Her ladies, drenched in tears and blood, carried the box to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where a shallow grave waited, or rather, didn't. There was no grave ready at all. They dug one on the spot, right there on the cold stone floor. They lowered the chest, covered it with earth, and walked away. No name, no marker, no trace. The Queen who had broken England's bond with Rome was buried like contraband under a church floor. It should have ended there. Henry VIII made sure of that. Within hours, Anne's emblems were ripped from palace walls, her portraits taken down, her initial B chiselled off the stone arches of Hampton Court. The country was ordered to forget her. Her name was scratched out from official records. It was as if the woman who had once been the centre of an empire's obsession had never existed at all. But erasure is never perfect. Something always lingers, the rumour, the whisper, the ghost that refuses to fade. Anne's ghost began not as a spirit, but as a memory lodged in her daughter's blood. Elizabeth was barely 3 years old when her mother died, declared illegitimate by Parliament, cast aside into obscurity. Yet the little girl would grow into the woman who would rule England for 45 years, the Virgin Queen, the heir to the woman they called a witch. Elizabeth never spoke her mother's name in public, never dared to honour her openly. But everything about her reign, the pearls she wore, the caution she lived by, the brilliance of her solitude, was a secret echo of Anne. Through Elizabeth, the woman who had been beheaded for ambition became immortal. But to understand why Anne's head fell, why an entire religion fractured over her body, we must go backward to when she was only a courtier's daughter with dark eyes and dangerous intelligence. She learned early that silence was power. In the French court, she mastered the art of charm like a weapon. Every smile, a calculation. Every refusal, a test. When Henry VIII noticed her, she said no. That word no became the spark that burned down centuries of Catholic authority. A king tore England from Rome not for theology, but for desire, A woman's refusal changed the fate of a continent. For a brief moment, she had everything, crowned in Westminster Abbey, draped in purple, carrying the promise of a son that never came. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was born instead, a disappointment wrapped in silk. From that day, the love that had once consumed Henry began to rot. Miscarriage followed miscarriage. Whispers gathered like smoke. Enemies circled. And then came Jane Seymour, the quiet contrast to Anne's brilliance. The king, tired of being defied, began to dream of obedience. Divorce was impossible. Death, however, could be sanctified by law. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's right hand, built the case with clockwork precision: adultery, witchcraft, treason, incest. 5 men were accused of sleeping with the Queen. One of them, her own brother. Confessions were wrung from torture. Timelines invented. Witnesses bribed. But truth didn't matter. What mattered was spectacle. The execution of those men was a prelude to hers. Bodies dragged through streets. Limbs severed. Heads boiled and spiked on London Bridge. The capital reeked of blood and fear. And still, Anne waited in her tower rooms, writing letters that no one would ever read. The trial was a theatre of humiliation. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided. Her father sat silently among the jurors. When the verdict of death was pronounced, she bowed her head, not in defeat, but in control. Eva condemned. She managed the narrative. She spoke of forgiveness, of faith, of obedience to the king, knowing every word would outlive her body. For 4 nights she lay awake in the tower, her mind pacing the walls, half praying, half laughing about her little neck. In the end, she faced the sword as if walking to a coronation. But the horror was not in the moment of death. It was in what followed. The absence of ceremony, the anonymity of the grave, the slow rewriting of history. For almost 3 centuries, no one knew where she lay. When workers finally lifted the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula in the 19th century, they found bones in a small arrow chest, delicate, female, with a neck cleanly severed by a sword. Was it her? No one could say with certainty. But perhaps uncertainty is her last revenge. Even now, Anne Boleyn refuses to be pinned down. She was called a seductress, a heretic, a witch, a traitor. Yet she became the mother of the greatest monarch England ever knew. She died dishonoured, but history bent itself to her shape. The head that fell in 1536 would haunt kings, priests, and poets for centuries. And maybe that is the true horror, not the swing of the sword, but the realization that a woman's story, once severed, cannot be buried. It grows back, again and again, whispering from beneath the stone floors of a chapel, from the blood-soaked grass of Tower Green, from the lips of anyone who dares to speak her name. That is the story you are about to hear, not of death alone, but of what death failed to silence. In the next chapters, we will walk back through the corridors of her life, the court, the love, the betrayal, the final night, and descend, piece by piece, into the mystery of what really happened to Anne Boleyn's head. Long before she knelt on the scaffold beneath that grey English sky, Anne Boleyn had already begun to shape her own legend. She was not born to a crown, nor even close to one. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a man of restless ambition, a courtier who knew that survival in Tudor England meant knowing how to read the wind, how to bow to power, and how to sell charm like coin. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from nobility, but their name carried no weight in the dynasties that mattered. What Anne inherited was not power, but hunger. That hunger would carry her across the Channel, into the glittering court of France, where she learned the dangerous art of being noticed. France was where the English girls were transformed into women who understood the rhythm of royal desire. At the court of Queen Claude and later under the influence of Marguerite of Navarre, Anne was surrounded by poetry, philosophy, perfume, and performance. She learned to move like a shadow draped in silk, to let a single look mean more than 100 words, to flirt without surrendering, and to observe without ever revealing what she truly thought. The French called her l'étrangère, the strange one, because she was not classically beautiful like the blonde, full-lipped ladies who filled the salons. But there was something sharper about her, a vitality in her eyes that seemed to ask a question no one wanted to answer. In a world ruled by men and priests, she was learning how to survive by turning herself into an idea, something untouchable, something dangerous, something unforgettable. When Anne returned to England around 1522, she came back, changed. The English court was smaller, meaner, colder than France, more mud than marble, but the air was thick with intrigue. Henry VIII ruled like a sun that never set, and every man and woman at court revolved around his moods, his hungers, his whims. His wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, was pious, proud, and aging. Her inability to produce a surviving son was an open wound in the monarchy, one that everyone pretended not to see. The king's gaze had already fallen on one Boleyn girl before Mary, Anne's sister, a brief, bright affair that ended in silence and whispers. But when Henry noticed Anne, expecting her to play the same role, he met resistance. Anne told him no, not in defiance exactly, but in calculation. She had watched what happened to women who yielded to kings. They burned brightly, then vanished. She would not be a mistress, she would be a queen or nothing. And so began one of the most perilous games ever played between a man who thought he was God and a woman who knew she could make him bleed. The court whispered that she bewitched him, that she had 6 fingers on one hand, that she used dark charms to twist his will. In truth, her magic was something far more terrifying, intelligence and patience. She made Henry wait. For years, she fed him a diet of longing and denial until his desire turned to obsession. He wrote her letters in his own hand, letters so tender, so desperate. They almost seemed to belong to another man entirely. He promised her the world, swore he would defy the Pope himself if it meant claiming her, and he did. The great schism between Rome and England was born not of theology, but of lust disguised as divine revelation. The Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, and in fury, the king tore England from the Catholic Church, naming himself supreme head of the new Church of England. Monasteries burned, priests were hanged, relics were smashed, and through the smoke of it all stood Anne, radiant and calm, wearing the tiny gold pendant of an initial B. In 1533, her triumph was complete. She was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony dripping with gold and incense. She was already pregnant, the court whispering that she carried the future of England beneath her heart. But when the child was born that September, the midwives' faces told the truth, before the words could. It was a girl. The Queen had given the king not a son, but a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment curdled quickly. He told himself there would be sons later, but doubt had already entered his veins. Anne, fierce and proud, refused to bow to it. She named her daughter after both grandmothers, wrapped her in silk, and told everyone who would listen that Elizabeth would one day rule. Those words would prove prophetic. But at the time, they were considered arrogance bordering on treason. Anne's reign was not peace, but a constant battle fought with smiles and scripture. She pushed for reform, protected scholars of the new faith, and challenged bishops who muttered against her. She spoke in council, offered opinions, interrupted men who thought women should only listen. In another age, she might have been celebrated for her brilliance. In the 16th century, it made her enemies multiply. Every man at court who resented her rise began to whisper her downfall. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, plotted quietly. Her father looked away. Her ladies, once allies, became spies. Even her chaplains kept notes of what she said and when she prayed. The walls of her chamber had ears, and those ears belonged to men who wanted her dead. By 1536, fate began to close its jaws. A fall from grace always begins with silence. A husband's coldness at dinner. A message unanswered. A smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Anne suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. The last one on the very day Catherine of Aragon was buried. Superstition twisted the coincidence into omen. The king's faith in her crumbled, and into that hollow space stepped Jane Seymour. Soft-spoken, pale, obedient everything Anne was not. Henry began to call Jane his true love. He began to imagine a world where Anne had never existed. Cromwell, sensing the shift, acted swiftly. He had once been Anne's ally in reform, but now he saw that her fall could buy him survival. He began gathering names, stories, and rumors servants' gossip twisted into evidence. Glances turned into crimes. Mark Smeaton, the young musician who adored her, was tortured until he confessed to sleeping with the Queen. One confession was all Cromwell needed to hang a web of lies upon. Before the month was over, 5 men were doomed, and the Queen was accused of treason. The very word sealed her fate. When the guards came for her on May the 2nd, Anne was watching a tournament at Greenwich Palace. She did not resist. She asked only one question: will I die without justice? And when the constable of the Tower said nothing, she understood. On the barge that carried her to the Tower, she must have looked across the water and remembered her coronation. The same river glittering with banners and music. Now it was quiet. No applause. Only the slap of oars and the dark reflection of her own face. Inside the Tower, they gave her rooms once meant for queens. But they felt like a tomb. She prayed, wrote letters, and waited for news. Outside, her enemies prepared the show that would seal her name in infamy. She would stand before 1,000 spectators, accused by her own uncle, condemned by her own father, betrayed by her own blood. In a matter of days, the woman who had rewritten England's faith would be reduced to a single word: guilty. Yet in that waiting, she became something else, not a victim, not yet a ghost, but a kind of mirror in which the cruelty of power could see itself. That is how the world ends for a queen, not in fire or glory, but in silence so deep it hums inside the bones. The days ahead would strip her of every dignity, but they could not strip her of presence. She would go to her death with the poise of a woman who had once made a king tremble. And in that final stillness, before the sword fell, England would look upon her and see not a witch or a traitor, but the terrible beauty of consequence. The next morning, the Tower would stir with preparations. The scaffold would rise. The executioner's sword would gleam like a blade of morning light. But before that, before the blood, before the final prayer, Anne Boleyn would stand before the men who had destroyed her and speak words that would echo across centuries. That is where we will go next. The morning of her trial dawned cold and pale, the kind of light that makes stone look like bone. The Tower of London had never slept well that night. Servants whispered in corridors. Guards drank to calm their nerves, and even the ravens seemed to keep their distance. Inside her chamber, Anne Boleyn dressed with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. She chose a gown of black velvet trimmed in ermine, the colour of mourning, but also of rank, and she pinned her hair so that it would not shake when she bowed her head. When they came for her, she did not cry. She walked through the corridors she once ruled, her steps echoing against the same walls that had heard her laughter 3 years earlier when she had been queen. Everything smelled of damp iron and dust, as if the tower itself were holding its breath. The great hall was already filled when she entered. Over 2,000 people had gathered, nobles, courtiers, and commoners alike, pressed shoulder to shoulder to see the downfall of a woman who had changed their world. The hall was lit with torches, their flames trembling in the draughts that crept through the ancient stone. At the far end sat the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, his face carved into a mask of duty, presiding as Lord High Steward. To his right sat her father, Thomas Boleyn, the man who had built his fortune on her rise and would now preserve it by voting for her death. Anne took her place before them and looked up, her dark eyes steady, her posture perfect. She did not speak until she was spoken to. The charges were read, one after another, like knives being laid out in a row. Adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother George, conspiracy to kill the king, mocking the royal bed. Each accusation was more grotesque than the last, each designed to strip her of dignity before the world. As the words filled the hall, Anne stood motionless. The crowd watched her face, waiting for her to crumble. But she did not. When they allowed her to answer, she lifted her chin slightly, her voice clear, and even carrying to the furthest corners of the hall, she denied every charge. She spoke not as a supplicant, but as a queen addressing her court. She reminded them of the impossible dates, of the witnesses who lied, of the men already tortured into confession. She asked for fairness, though she knew there would be none. There was a strange silence when she finished, the kind that falls when a truth has been spoken in a room built on lies. Even her enemies could feel it. A few of the peers shifted uneasily. Some avoided her gaze, but it changed nothing. The verdict had been written long before the trial began. The Duke of Norfolk stood, his voice trembling only slightly, as he pronounced her guilty of all charges, sentencing her to death, by either burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. The hall exhaled in one long murmur of disbelief and satisfaction, like a wave breaking on a shore. Anne bowed her head briefly and then raised it again. Her composure did not falter. She thanked the court for their fairness, forgave those who had wronged her, and prayed aloud that God would save the king. For never prince had more gentleness in him. It was a masterpiece of control. Every word, a blade wrapped in silk. When she was led away, a few people in the crowd began to weep, not because they believed her innocent, but because they had seen something rare, a human being facing annihilation without surrender. Back in her chambers, she asked for paper and ink. She wrote 2 letters that we know of, though neither survives. One was to Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had helped make her queen. The other was to Henry himself. In it, she did not beg for life. She begged for mercy toward the men who had died for her sake. She wrote of Elizabeth, asking that their daughter be cared for, that her name not be cursed. Whether Henry ever read the letter, no one knows. By then, he had already moved Jane Seymour to a house on the river and ordered new garments for her coronation. The days that followed were filled with a strange stillness. Anne's mood swung between bright calm and hysterical laughter. The women assigned to watch her half attendants, half spies, reported everything she said. Sometimes she joked about her death, saying that she had a little neck, and the French executioner would have an easy task. Other times, she knelt for hours in prayer, whispering the same words again and again until her voice cracked. She asked if the men had died bravely. She asked if anyone still believed she was innocent. And then she stopped asking. On the night before her execution, she received the Eucharist and swore upon it that she had never been unfaithful to the king. Those present said her hands did not tremble. She then lay down to rest, though rest was impossible. Outside, the tower was alive, with small noises, the clink of armor, the low hum of voices preparing the scaffold. When dawn came, she dressed herself once more, this time in a gown of grey damask with a crimson petticoat. She covered her shoulders with a fur mantle and walked to the window. The sky was clear, a pale blue streaked with gold, cruelly beautiful. Somewhere beyond those walls, her daughter was playing, unaware that her mother's life was ending that morning. At 8 o'clock, she was told the time had been moved forward. Instead of noon, it would be 9. Anne thanked the messenger. She seemed relieved. Waiting had become unbearable. She asked to see the executioner, the man brought from France for this single moment, and spoke to him kindly, assuring him of her forgiveness. She even tipped him a few coins. "Do your office well," she said quietly, "and I shall say nothing." When the hour came, she stepped out into the sunlight. The grass on Tower Green glistened with dew. Around the scaffold stood the guards, the officials, and 1,000 witnesses holding their breath. The French swordsman stood beside a low wooden platform covered in fresh straw. Anne mounted the steps unassisted. She looked small but composed, her face pale, her eyes luminous. Turning to the crowd, she gave her final speech, a careful, graceful lie meant to protect her daughter and soothe her killer. She declared she came to die according to the law, praised the king as a gentle prince, and asked the people to pray for both of them. Her voice did not waver. She ended with the same words she had repeated all night, to Jesus Christ. "I commend my soul." Then she removed her headdress and knelt on the straw, her hands folded, her gaze fixed ahead. The executioner, waiting behind her, called to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." It was a trick, meant to distract her so she would not flinch. As she turned her head slightly toward the voice, the blade flashed in a single, perfect arc. Those who saw it said it was so swift they could not tell when it struck. Her lips were still moving when her head fell into the straw. The crowd gasped, but did not cheer. Even the ravens were silent. Her ladies climbed the steps, lifted the body, gathered the head, and looked for something, anything to place her in. There was no coffin. Only an arrow chest left forgotten in storage, long and narrow. They placed her inside, folding her limbs so that the lid would close. The body of a queen forced into a box built for weapons. The blood soaked through the wood. They carried it across the grass to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where the chaplain waited with a shovel and a short prayer. A hole was dug beside the altar, barely 3 feet deep. The chest was lowered, the earth replaced, and the stones set back unevenly. No name was marked, no record kept. By sunset, the scaffold was dismantled. The straw burned, the stains scrubbed. Within a day, Tower Green looked ordinary again, as though nothing had happened. But history does not forget so easily. The memory of that morning, of the quiet dignity with which Anne met her end, began to spread. Even those who hated her spoke of her courage. In the years to come, Henry would try to erase her completely, but her shadow would remain in his dreams, in his daughter's eyes, in every crack of the stones that had drunk her blood. And so, the queen who died without justice began the second half of her story, the part written not by power, but by memory, the part where silence itself becomes rebellion. And while her body slept beneath the chapel floor, the name Anne Boleyn would start to rise again, whispered by those who wondered if England had killed not a sinner, but its own conscience. The days following Anne Boleyn's death were filled with the kind of silence that settles only after something unforgivable. London carried on, markets opened. Bells rang. Children shouted in the narrow streets, but beneath it all was an uneasy hum, as though the city itself knew that something monstrous had just been done. Within the tower, servants moved quickly to erase the evidence. The scaffold was taken apart, and its wood reused for repairs in the armory. The straw, soaked with the blood of a queen, was gathered and burned. The arrow chest that held her body was covered with soil, and the patch of disturbed earth in the chapel was flattened until it looked like every other stone. By the time the sun rose on the second day, there was no sign of her, no sound, no trace, no scent of what had happened. Henry VIII had not only killed his wife, he had attempted to erase her as if she were a mistake written on parchment that could simply be scraped clean. But history, unlike parchment, does not erase so easily. Even as courtiers whispered their congratulations to the king on his new freedom, the image of Anne's final moment clung to them. Those who had watched her execution spoke of her calmness with awe and discomfort. They said her blood had soaked the straw like spilled wine. They said her lips had moved after the sword fell, forming the words, "Jesu, receive my soul." Some swore her eyes had opened for a heartbeat after the cut, that her gaze had fallen upon them like judgment. Whether these tales were true or born of guilt hardly mattered. The myth of Anne began not with her life, but with her death. And even the men who had condemned her began to feel haunted by it. Henry, meanwhile, moved with chilling speed. The very next morning, he ordered his household to prepare for his marriage to Jane Seymour. On May 20th, just one day after Anne's execution, he was betrothed to her, and within 11 days, they were married in quiet ceremony. The courtiers who had cheered for Anne only a few years earlier now praised Jane with equal fervour. Such was survival in the Tudor court. Loyalty was a performance, and everyone was an actor, hoping to keep their head. The people, however, were not so easily convinced. Londoners spoke in taverns and on street corners, saying that no good could come from a king who killed his wives. Some even muttered that the ghost of Anne Boleyn had been seen wandering the tower, carrying her severed head like a lantern. But the true haunting came in the years that followed, when Henry realized that even in death, Anne's presence refused to leave him. The reform she had inspired the break with Rome, the creation of the Church of England could not be undone. Monasteries were still being dissolved, their treasures seized, their monks scattered or executed. The spiritual wound she had opened in the heart of England was permanent, and every time Henry signed a decree or took communion in his new church, he was forced to remember the woman who had made it possible. She had died a traitor, but she had also made him a god in his own kingdom. It was a paradox he could never escape. For Elizabeth, the child Anne had left behind, the consequences were immediate and cruel. Declared illegitimate by Parliament, she was stripped of her royal title and moved to a small household in Hatfield, under the supervision of caretakers who treated her with polite indifference. Her clothes were outgrown, her tutor dismissed, her allowance reduced. She was a shadow of what she had been meant to be, the daughter of a queen who no longer existed in the eyes of the world. Yet the girl showed a strange resilience even then. She studied quietly, learned her Latin and Greek, and listened more than she spoke. The few who met her remarked that she carried herself with an eerie composure, so like her mother's that it made people uncomfortable. When she looked at them with those dark, steady eyes, they said, It felt as though Anne Boleyn was staring through her child's face, demanding to be remembered. Henry, of course, avoided his daughter. She reminded him too much of everything he wanted to forget the fever of his desire, the ruin it had caused, the crown that had turned to ashes in his hands. He poured his attention into Jane Seymour, who seemed the perfect antidote to Anne, quiet, obedient, fertile. When Jane gave birth to a son, Edward, in October 1537, the king wept with joy. He called Jane his true wife, and for a brief time he believed he had finally been forgiven by God. But divine mercy was not so easily bought. 12 days later, Jane died from childbed fever, and Henry's joy curdled once again into grief. In his private moments, when he was left alone in the echoing halls of his palaces, he was said to mutter Anne's name, not in love, but in anger, as though blaming her ghost for every misfortune that followed. The tower itself never forgot her. The yeoman warders, the old guards whose families lived within those stone walls, spoke of strange things after dusk, of the faint sound of silk brushing along the corridors where no one walked, of a woman's voice murmuring prayers in a language no one recognized, of a figure in grey appearing near the chapel, her head held gently in her hands. These tales spread, changing shape with each generation. Some said her spirit rose only on May 19th, the anniversary of her death. Others said she never left at all, that the stones themselves still remembered her heartbeat. Tourists and nobles alike would later claim to feel a chill when they stood upon Tower Green, as if the air itself carried her memory. In 1547, when Henry finally died, he was buried beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he considered pure. Yet history would betray him, as it often does tyrants. His body decayed rapidly, leaking through the coffin, and dogs were said to have licked at the blood seeping from beneath the lid. The man who had sought to erase his wives was himself reduced to a grotesque legend, and while his flesh rotted in Windsor, the legacy of Anne Boleyn endured, growing stronger with every generation that tried to silence it. By the time Elizabeth came of age, England had changed beyond recognition. 3 more queens had worn the crown, and none had ruled long without tragedy. Yet among them, none shone so fiercely as Anne's daughter. When Mary Tudor, the devout Catholic child of Catherine of Aragon, died without heirs, the throne passed to Elizabeth. The bastard child of a disgraced queen became the ruler of England, and with that single act of destiny, Anne Boleyn's ghost was vindicated. Elizabeth never publicly spoke of her mother, never built her a tomb, or cleared her name. But those who knew her said she wore a small ring from her youth until her death, and hidden inside was a tiny portrait, one side her own likeness, the other a dark-haired woman believed to be Anne, when Elizabeth sat on her throne wearing pearls, the gemstone her mother had loved most. People whispered that the Virgin Queen carried her mother's spirit in every thread of her gown. It was as if Anne had risen again through her child, not as a wife or a victim, but as the mother of England's golden age. And so the story that began with a French sword ended not in silence, but in triumph. The woman who had been buried in an arrow chest without a name had become the mother of a queen who would rule for nearly half a century. Power had devoured her body, but could not consume her legacy. Even the stones that covered her grave seemed to hum with defiance. For centuries after, visitors to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula would kneel beside the marble tile that bears her name, Anne Boleyn, 1536, and feel the faint echo of her pulse beneath it. They say if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice in the hush of the tower at night, whispering not of vengeance, but of survival, as if reminding the living that even in death, she won. Century passed, And yet the Tower of London never slept easily. Time washed over its stones like the tide, smoothing nothing, only deepening the grooves where memory had lodged itself. The world beyond changed the kings, the queens, the languages of prayer, but within those grey walls, the ghosts of the condemned lingered. Of all of them, none whispered louder than the woman who had once been Queen of England for 3 short years. Anne Boleyn, executed in 1536, forgotten by decree and buried in silence, had become the Tower's most persistent presence. Her story, buried with her bones, began to stir again in the dark corners of history, called forth by curiosity, superstition, and the human need to make sense of cruelty. By the 18th century, London had grown fat and restless. The Tower, no longer a fortress of fear, had become a museum of old wars, a relic filled with stories of execution and treason that tourists came to gawk at. Guides told the tale of Anne Boleyn to thrill and horrify their guests, painting her as a phantom beauty walking at midnight, her head tucked under her arm, her eyes open and unblinking. They said her spirit appeared before the death of a royal, gliding across Tower Green in moonlight, so pale it looked like frost. Some swore they heard her laughter echoing through the corridors where she had once lived, light and mocking, as if she found the living endlessly amusing. Rational men scoffed at these stories, but they told them anyway, because England, for all its pride in logic and empire, had never outgrown its appetite for ghosts. The truth, however, is stranger than legend. In 1876, during a renovation of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, workers uncovered a cluster of skeletons buried beneath the uneven stones near the altar. The graves were shallow, hurried, mixed with fragments of coffin wood and rusted nails. Among them was a set of remains that drew immediate attention, a woman's bones, small, delicate, the skull severed cleanly at the neck by what experts recognized as the sweep of a blade rather than the hack of an axe. The curvature of the jaw suggested youth. The hands were fine, boned, the spine lightly curved as if accustomed to carrying the weight of elaborate gowns. There was no name, no marker, no jewelry, only the clean wound across the vertebrae and the undeniable presence of tragedy. The discovery spread through London like wildfire. Could it be her? After nearly 300 years, had Anne Boleyn finally been found? The Victorians, with their love of mystery and mourning, were captivated. Newspapers printed dramatic illustrations of the skeleton. Artists painted romantic scenes of her burial, and historians debated endlessly over the evidence. Measurements of the bones were compared to accounts of her appearance, her height, her slender build, the shape of her hands. Some swore it matched perfectly. Others argued it could not be her, that too many women had died in that same place. But proof did not matter. England wanted to believe that Anne had been found, that at last her story had a resting place. The skeleton was carefully reinterred beneath the chapel floor. This time with ceremony and reverence. A marble tile was placed above it, engraved simply with her name and the year of her death. Anne Boleyn, 1536. That quiet white stone became a pilgrimage site. Visitors knelt beside it, leaving flowers and notes written in trembling handwriting, messages of apology, admiration, sorrow. "You were wronged," one said. "You changed everything," said another. Centuries after her death, Anne had become something larger than a queen or a ghost. She was a symbol of defiance, of a woman punished for daring to exist too loudly in a world built for silence. Historians began to re-examine her not as a witch or seductress, but as a political figure, educated, articulate, cunning. The Protestant Reformation that had reshaped England could no longer be told without her. The Age of Elizabeth. The Wars of Faith. The very structure of modern monarchy, all of it had roots in the choices she made, the risks she took, and the price she paid. Her resurrection in the public imagination was not gentle. The Victorians turned her into an idol of tragedy, a heroine wrapped in sorrow and purity. Paintings showed her kneeling in white, eyes raised heavenward, surrounded by shadows of mercy and light. Plays and novels recast her as a victim of passion and politics, the doomed lover of a monstrous king. It was a convenient narrative, one that allowed the age to feel moral superiority over the barbarism of the past. But the real Anne was more dangerous than that. She had not been innocent in the way the Victorians imagined. She had been ambitious, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to manipulate her world. She had been human, and it was her humanity that made her story so impossible to bury. Each generation reinvented her in its own image. In the 20th century, she became a feminist icon. The woman who refused to yield to power, the first to turn her intelligence into armor in a court ruled by men. In the 21st, she became a symbol of fascination itself, the subject of endless books, films, and debates. People studied her letters, her portrait, her jewelry. They analyzed her handwriting, the curve of her bee necklace, the structure of her cheekbones, as if decoding her would somehow solve the riddle of ambition and desire. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Anne Boleyn endures because she is all contradictions at once, sinner and saint, lover and strategist, victim and architect of her own doom. She is not one story, but many. And each time we tell it, she looks back at us with new eyes. Even now, when you walk through the Tower grounds in the late afternoon, when the air is cool and the ravens circle lazily above, there is a stillness that feels almost aware. The tourists talk softly, the guides lower their voices, and somewhere beneath the flagstones of the chapel, the remains of Anne Boleyn lie among the bones of others who died in the same cause, men and women who stood too close to the flame of royal favour. Her grave is small, easily missed if you don't know where to look. But once you find it, you cannot look away. The stone is smooth from centuries of footsteps, the lettering worn faint by time, and yet, standing there, you can feel her presence as vividly as if she had just turned the corner and brushed past you, leaving the faintest scent of rose oil in the air. Her story is not a tragedy that ended in blood, but a testament to endurance. She died believing she had failed, that her name would be cursed and her daughter forgotten. Yet the child she left behind became the most powerful monarch England ever knew. Elizabeth's reign would be her mother's revenge, the vindication of a woman whose voice refused to fade. Even in silence, Anne had outlasted the men who killed her, the king who betrayed her, and the centuries that tried to define her. And that is why, when night falls over the tower and the last of the visitors are gone, it is said that the guards sometimes hear a soft rustle of fabric, the light scrape of slippers on stone. They do not speak of it aloud, but they know what it means. The Queen walks still, not seeking vengeance, not lost, but reminding the world that history is not written by those who live it, is written by those who endure. And Anne Boleyn endures. It is strange how time softens the edges of horror until only fascination remains. Centuries had turned Anne Boleyn's death into a story told by candlelight, stripped of its stench and fear, until the world forgot what it really meant to die, for the crime of being extraordinary. But deep beneath the stones of London, where the air still tastes of salt and rust, the truth of her suffering never stopped breathing. Her story did not end with her burial. It seeped into the bones of England itself. It lived in the silence between church bells, in the tremor of women's voices who spoke too boldly, in the unease that still haunted men who feared what they could not control. The Tower of London became a monument not to victory or power, but to guilt, a reminder that the ghosts of history never rest when justice has not been served. By the dawn of the 19th century, England was drunk on progress and empire, but also nostalgic for its own shadows. The Victorians, those lovers of death and moral order, rediscovered Anne Boleyn with the same hunger they reserved for saints and sinners. They painted her as an angel wronged by lust, her pale neck glowing beneath the imagined sunlight of her execution. Playwrights wrote tragedies where she forgave Henry with saintly grace. Composers turned her story into operas sung by trembling sopranos who died beautifully beneath velvet curtains. No one wanted to remember that the real Anne had been clever, sarcastic, and dangerously alive. They preferred her as a martyr, clean, pale, and tragic, because a beautiful victim fits more comfortably into history than a brilliant survivor. But while the Victorians romanticized her, the historians began to dig, not only into the chapel floor, but into the archives of a nation that had once tried to forget her. Letters long buried in dust were read again, each one a whisper from the past. Anne's voice, sharp and articulate, spoke through them her pleas to Cromwell, her arguments with bishops, her tender concern for Elizabeth. She had not been a passive figure floating in the tide of a king's obsession. She had been the current itself, pushing England toward change it could not yet understand. Her faith had not been born of rebellion, but of conviction. Her influence on religion, less a weapon than an awakening. To re-examine her life was to discover that the line between witch and visionary is drawn by whoever holds the sword. In the same century, women began to look upon Anne with a new kind of recognition. The suffragettes marching through London carried her image on banners, calling her the first English woman to die for her voice. To them, Anne was not a ghost, but a mirror proof that the price of power had always been blood, that every woman who dared to demand more than obedience carried a piece of her legacy. They saw in her the same hunger that burned in themselves the refusal to kneel, the courage to say no, the knowledge that the world might destroy them for saying it. And in that strange way, Anne Boleyn's death began to breathe again, transformed from a royal scandal into a prophecy. The more her story was told, the more it changed. In one century she was a saint, in another a temptress, in another a political revolutionary. Each retelling peeled back a layer, and yet she remained unknowable. Perhaps that is what keeps her alive, the mystery that no history book can pin down. What was she thinking as she waited in her tower cell? Was she terrified? Or furious? Or at peace? Did she still love Henry in some secret part of herself? Or had she long since stopped believing he was human? We cannot know. The walls of the tower have heard every scream and prayer ever spoken within them, but they keep their secrets. Even now, scholars argue over her bones. The skeleton found in 1876 is believed to be hers, yet there is no proof. Some say the remains belong to another noblewoman, executed under a later king, that Anne still lies somewhere deeper, beyond reach. Others whisper that her body was moved quietly during the reign of her daughter Elizabeth, reburied in a hidden crypt, so that no man could ever again desecrate her grave. The uncertainty feels fitting. Anne Boleyn was never meant to rest quietly. Her life was an act of defiance. Her death, an unfinished conversation. She lives not in certainty but in echo. And what of Henry, the man who once risked his soul to possess her? His name is carved into every page of her story. But in the end, it is her memory that has endured. While his decayed into caricature, the king who broke his country for love became the bloated tyrant who ate himself into legend. His great palaces fell to ruin, His sons died young. His dynasty ended in a woman, the very thing he feared. The empire he sought to control was eventually ruled by the daughter of the wife he murdered. There is poetry in that kind of vengeance, a quiet symmetry that history rarely grants. When you stand today on Tower Green, surrounded by the cold embrace of those medieval walls, you can feel the weight of that symmetry pressing down. The grass grows lush and dark, nourished by centuries of rain and the memory of spilled blood. A small glass memorial marks the place where Anne knelt. Tourists walk past, their voices hushed, as if instinctively aware that this patch of ground does not belong to the living. The guide's words fade. The sound of traffic dissolves. And for a brief moment, the centuries collapse. You can almost see her there, a figure in grey. Her face calm, her lips moving in prayer. The wind stirs, and the air tastes of iron. Inside the chapel nearby, the marble tile that bears her name gleams faintly in the dim light. Beneath it, her bones, if they are hers, rest among the remains of other victims of power. Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Thomas More, all sharing the same narrow earth. Their stories intertwine like roots beneath the floor, feeding one another, reminding every visitor that history is not a clean line but a tangled forest of regret. Sometimes flowers appear on Anne's grave, fresh and fragrant, left by strangers who feel they owe her something. Sometimes there are letters folded neatly and tucked between the cracks of the stone. They say things like, "You were brave," or "You deserved better," or simply, "I remember." Perhaps that is all she ever wanted to be remembered, not as a ghost, not as a symbol, but as a woman who lived and dared and paid the price. At night, when the tourists are gone and the tower falls into its ancient stillness, the guards who patrol its grounds say that the air changes. The wind carries a sound too soft to be footsteps, too deliberate to be wind. They never speak of it openly, but among themselves they tell the same story, that when the moonlight falls across Tower Green, it sometimes touches the grass in the shape of a kneeling woman, her head bowed, her shadow long and trembling. They do not call it haunting, they call it memory, and maybe they are right. Because Anne Boleyn's ghost is not something that frightens, it is something that reminds. It reminds us that truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced, that even a head severed from its body can still change the course of a kingdom, and that every injustice, no matter how carefully buried, waits beneath the earth to rise again. Perhaps that is why, 500 years later, people still speak her name. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because deep down, they recognize something of themselves in her story, the longing to be seen, the courage to defy, the ache of being punished for wanting more. History may belong to kings, but legacy belongs to those who refuse to disappear. And Anne Boleyn, queen, heretic, mother, survivor, will never disappear. The centuries kept turning, and yet her story refused to close. Every age found its reflection in her eyes. Every century heard something new in the echo of her last prayer. The Victorians had turned Anne Boleyn into a tragic heroine. But the world that came after began to peel away the silk and sentiment to reveal the human beneath the woman who had not been a saint or a martyr, but a strategist, a survivor, and, above all, a catalyst. She was no longer just the doomed wife of a tyrant. She was the spark that lit a fuse still burning beneath the foundations of modern England. To understand Anne Boleyn now is to understand how a single life can fracture history, how a moment of defiance can echo across 5 centuries. By the early 20th century, historians had grown bolder, daring to see Anne not through the eyes of her enemies or the fantasies of her admirers, but through her own choices, They found a woman who used her intelligence as armor, her wit as a weapon, her faith as both shield and burden. They traced her steps through the French court, where she had learned grace like a language, and they saw how she carried that poise back to a country that mistrusted clever women. They read her letters, every stroke of ink, every polite flourish, and heard the pulse of someone who understood power better than the men who thought they wielded it. She was not merely a pawn moved by kings and ministers. She was the one who had taught them how the game could be played. Modern scholars began to look at the evidence with colder eyes, stripping away the myths that had wrapped her like a shroud. The tales of witchcraft, the accusations of seduction, the invention of a sixth finger, all fabrications meant to reduce her to something monstrous, to make sense of her power by branding it unnatural. Yet the records spoke of a woman fluent in multiple languages, adept in diplomacy, and confident enough to debate theology with bishops. When Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, it was not only because of desire, but because Anne gave him an intellectual and spiritual justification for doing so. She brought him books banned in Europe, whispered the ideas of reformers who believed that kings answered not to popes but to God. Without her, the Reformation in England might have arrived slowly, cautiously. With her, it came like a storm, and that storm reshaped everything. The monasteries fell, the altars cracked. Latin gave way to English in prayer. It is impossible to separate the story of modern Britain from the woman who provoked its rupture. Yet the cost of change is always blood. And Anne's was the first spilled in the name of the new world she helped create. Even her enemies seemed to understand this in time. Centuries after her death, the same church that had condemned her name whispered prayers over her grave. And the same monarchy that once called her a traitor now celebrated her daughter as one of its greatest sovereigns. History, that long and merciless mirror, had turned, and in its reflection, Anne was no longer the villain. In art and literature, she continued to evolve. Writers began to give her back her voice, not the trembling voice of a victim, but the measured, cutting tone of a woman who understood her audience too well. In novels, she became cunning and ambitious, sometimes cold, sometimes compassionate, but always alive. Filmmakers would later bring her to the screen in lavish dresses and shadowed corridors, her beauty both weapon and curse. Each portrayal was different, yet in every version, she carried the same truth: she was never meant to be forgotten. Even when her head rolled into straw, she refused to disappear. Her story had become something elemental, as natural to English history as the rain. What fascinates most about Anne Boleyn is not her death, but her transformation. In life, she was a woman surrounded by suspicion. In death, she became a mirror for all of humanity's contradictions. She was both adored and hated, blamed and worshipped, erased and resurrected. Each retelling reshapes her, and yet something unchanging burns at the core, a sense of defiance that time cannot smother. Perhaps that is why she haunts so many minds, why the thought of her still stirs unease. She reminds us that truth is never simple, that power always demands payment, and that the ones we destroy often become the very myths that define us. The more we learn about her, the more we understand the men who killed her. Henry, Cromwell, Norfolk, all were architects of order. Men who built systems meant to outlive them. Yet centuries, their monuments crumble, while Anne's story still lives, whispered by strangers who kneel before her unmarked grave. That is her final triumph. She became the history they tried to erase. She is the unfinished sentence in every account of the Tudor age. But the question that no one can answer: why did England need her to die? Was it fear, or love, or both? Sometimes it feels as if she still waits for an answer. The tower stands as her witness, its walls heavy with the memory of her last breath. When rain falls across the chapel roof, it sounds like the hush that must have filled the air after the sword struck. The guards who work there today still speak of her softly, as if she might be listening. They say that at certain hours, when the light fades and the Thames turns black beneath the bridge, the sound of footsteps can be heard on the old wooden floors, slow, deliberate, the echo of a woman pacing. They do not call it haunting anymore. They call it history refusing to fade. And maybe that is what Anne Boleyn truly became, not a ghost, not a legend, but a kind of eternal witness. Her story asks us to look again at how power devours what it cannot control, at how the world builds its future on the bodies of those who dared to speak. Each generation meets her differently, but the question she leaves behind is always the same. What is the price of being remembered? Her life was a gamble against oblivion, and though she lost her body, she won the wager. Every time her name is spoken, every time her story is told, she rises again from beneath that stone floor, not as a spectre of vengeance, but as the echo of courage itself. If you walk through the tower today, past the dark archways and the fluttering ravens, you might feel it, the pulse that has not stopped beating since that May morning of 1536. It hums faintly beneath the stones, in the air, in the heart of anyone who dares to listen. It is the sound of a woman who was told to vanish and chose instead to endure. And as the centuries stretch endlessly forward, long after thrones have fallen and kings have turned to dust, that sound remains. It is not the sound of death. It is the sound of persistence. It is the heartbeat of Anne Boleyn. Time has a way of polishing tragedy until it gleams like treasure. But if you scrape away the shine, what remains is raw and human fear, ambition, betrayal, love, twisted into ruin. For all the centuries that have passed, the story of Anne Boleyn has never lost that human pulse. It is not the tale of a crown or a king, or even of religion. It is the story of one woman who stood too close to power and refused to bow before it. That refusal, so small in the moment, rippled through generations until it reshaped the soul of a nation. She was the fracture in England's spine, the quiet rebellion that taught the world that even a single-voice female, defiant and condemned, could shake a throne. After her execution, the silence that Henry demanded never truly came. The courtiers who had watched her die tried to speak of other things, but her name lingered in every conversation, like a scent that could not be washed away. Even Henry himself, who moved on to Jane Seymour within days, was not spared. In the years that followed, he began to show the signs of a man devoured by his own guilt. His leg ulcer festered, his temper rotted, and his eyes, once bright with youth and conquest, turned hollow. He grew monstrous, swollen with power and fear, a king surrounded by ghosts he had created. And though he never spoke her name again, those who served him swore that sometimes, late at night, when the palace was quiet and the candles burned low, he would startle awake, gasping, as if a voice had whispered from the dark. Some said it was Anne. Some said it was his conscience. Perhaps they were the same thing. As England marched forward into new centuries, the memory of Anne Boleyn began to stretch beyond the borders of her own life. She became more than a queen who died. She became a question that refused to die with her. Each generation saw her differently, reshaping her into whatever reflection it needed most. In the Age of Empire, she was romanticized as a tragic lover who changed the world for passion's sake. In the Age of Reason, she was studied as the first modern political woman, a figure who understood the machinery of power long before the world would allow her to use it. And in the Age of Rebellion, when women began to fight for the right to be heard, She rose again as one of them, a sister across centuries, reminding them that the price of having a voice had always been blood. But beyond the myth, there are still traces of the woman. Her handwriting survives in fragments, her words precise, her thoughts careful but never meek. Her letters to Henry are full of intelligence and charm, written in the voice of a woman who knows her worth. She signs them with confidence, even when her world begins to crumble, and it is through those letters that we glimpse something essential. She was not born to be silent. Every loop of ink, every measured phrase carries the defiance of someone who believed her mind mattered as much as her beauty. That, perhaps, was the true heresy of Anne Boleyn, not her theology, not her ambition, but her belief that she could be equal to a king. The tower where she died still stands, and though it has seen the rise and fall of monarchs, the weight of her death never left it. The ravens that guard its walls flutter near the spot where she knelt, as if tethered by memory. Tourists visit now, their cameras clicking where once the air was filled with the metallic scent of blood. They walk past the chapel, unaware that beneath their feet lie the bones of queens and martyrs buried together in uneasy peace. The guides tell the story in hushed tones, their voices soft but charged, because even now, 500 years later, to speak her name within those walls feels like summoning something sacred and dangerous. Inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, sunlight filters through old glass, casting patterns of gold and blue across the worn stones. The marble tile that bears her name is small and simple, easily missed if one does not look down. But if you kneel and trace the letters with your fingers, you can feel the faint vibration of her presence there. As if the earth itself remembers, flowers lie scattered over the stone roses, lilies, sometimes wildflowers left by strangers who travelled across oceans just to stand for a moment in her company. Each petal is a confession, each bloom a small rebellion against the silence that once buried her. She is still gathering followers, still inspiring devotion, even in death. There is an unspoken poetry in the way her story and her daughters became one. Elizabeth's reign would later be called the Golden Age, but it was born out of the red dawn of her mother's execution. Every victory Elizabeth won, every speech that defied her enemies, every refusal to marry, carried the shadow of Anne's lessons. The Virgin Queen learned early that love could be lethal, that to belong to no man was the only way to rule. And so, in a strange symmetry, the daughter avenged the mother, not with blood but with brilliance. Where Anne had been silenced, Elizabeth spoke. Where Anne was broken, Elizabeth endured, and through her endurance, the world finally saw what Anne's defiance had tried to prove, that a woman's strength need not be borrowed from a man's permission. Yet even now, historians return to Anne's story as if drawn by gravity, searching for something they cannot quite name. Was she guilty of adultery, as the court claimed? Was she a manipulator, or merely manipulated? Or was she something far more complex, an early architect of her own fate, both victim and conspirator in the game that destroyed her? Every theory leads back to the same truth. She lived in a world that allowed her brilliance only as long as it pleased the man who ruled it. Once it frightened him, it killed her. And that, perhaps, is why she still speaks to us. Her story is not locked in the past. It lives wherever ambition and danger share a heartbeat. When night descends on the tower, and the city beyond glows with the pulse of modern life, the air around the chapel grows strangely still. Guards speak of hearing faint music drifting from nowhere, a melody like the sound of a lute or a woman humming softly to herself. The sound moves through the corridors, fading as suddenly as it appears. Some say it is the wind. Others swear it is Anne, walking again through the place where she loved, prayed, and died. But maybe the truth is simpler. Maybe the world remembers her not as a ghost, but as an idea too bright to fade, too dangerous to forget. 500 years ago, a sword silenced her voice. And yet, here we are, still telling her story, still whispering her name as though it carries some secret the world is not ready to release. That is her triumph, the victory that death could not take. Because Anne Boleyn's life was not just a tragedy, it was a mirror held up to every age that followed, showing us what happens when power fears intelligence, when love becomes tyranny, when truth refuses to die. Her body may rest beneath stone, but her defiance walks freely still. Across the green, where she fell, through the centuries that tried to bury her, and into the hearts of those who still listen for the heartbeat beneath the silence. History, like the sea, never stays still. It pulls what it once buried back to the surface, polishing bones into relics and regrets into lessons. Anne Boleyn's story has drifted through those tides for nearly 500 years, each generation dredging her name from the deep, each one finding a different reflection in her shadow. Some see her as a warning, others as a muse, and a few as a mirror for their own desires. But what remains, what has always remained, is the pulse of her defiance, steady and unbroken beneath the centuries. It's there, in the silence of the tower at dusk, in the hush that falls when her name is spoken aloud, and in the way England still cannot look away from her, as though she never truly left. Long after her death, the story of Anne's execution became something more than a historical fact. It became an obsession. People wanted to know not just what happened, but how it felt, what she thought in those last moments. Whether her soul had trembled or transcended as the sword came down, scholars wrote entire volumes on her final words, dissecting each syllable for meaning, as if truth could be measured in the rhythm of breath. The Victorians, those architects of tragedy, turned her death into art. They imagined her praying at dawn, bathed in divine light, a martyr too pure for the world that killed her. Painters captured her in the moment before death, eyes raised toward heaven, lips parted in forgiveness. They made her beautiful again, as though beauty could erase the violence. But the real Anne was not seeking sainthood. She was meeting her fate with the composure of someone who understood that dignity was the last power she could wield. Through time, her memory has evolved into something both intimate and colossal. In literature, she is resurrected again and again, a ghost who refuses peace, a lover wronged, a queen betrayed, a woman who lived too far ahead of her age. Novelists write her with sympathy, sometimes fury, always fascination. In film, she wears silks that shimmer under candlelight, her eyes full of secrets, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. Each actress who steps into her story adds a new layer to her legend, as though the world keeps trying to imagine what kind of woman could make a king unravel. It isn't just curiosity, it's recognition. We are still trying to understand how ambition, intelligence, and desire can exist in the same body without the world calling it sin. Yet for all the retellings, the heart of her story lies in the stillness that followed the sword. That silence is what defines her. It's what echoes through every retelling and every interpretation, the way power tries to silence truth, and the way truth, somehow, keeps speaking. In a world that has changed its shape 1,000 times, her silence still feels like a question. What happens when a woman dares to demand more than survival? What happens when her words cut sharper than the men who hold the blades? Those questions, unanswered and unending, are why Anne Boleyn never fades. She remains the unfinished thought in England's history, the wound that healed over, but never stopped aching. Her legacy stretches far beyond politics or faith. It is written in the evolution of how women are seen and remembered, Once, she was the seductress who led a king astray. Then she was the martyr who died for belief. Now she stands as something far greater, a symbol of transformation itself. Every woman who has ever been punished for her brilliance carries a piece of Anne's story. Every voice that has been silenced in the name of order echoes hers. And every person who has ever loved dangerously, who has ever tried to change the world with nothing but words and will, it knows what it means to stand where she stood. The line between her century and ours is thin. Her courage crosses it easily. Even in her daughter's reign, her presence never truly left the throne. Elizabeth ruled with the same sharp wit and calculated grace that had once made Anne both adored and feared. She learned from her mother's fall that love was a cage disguised as devotion, that power could never be shared safely. In her silence about Anne, Elizabeth built a kingdom strong enough to speak for both of them. She turned her mother's disgrace into her own authority, transforming shame into sovereignty. Every portrait of Elizabeth draped in jewels, her eyes watchful and wise, carries the shadow of the woman who made her possible. Together, they are the two halves of one story, the mother who died for the crown and the daughter who ruled by mastering its cruelty. Today, Anne Boleyn's world survives not in cathedrals or palaces, but in the quiet places where memory lingers. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula remains small and simple, but the air inside hums with reverence. Tourists shuffle past, whispering, unwilling to speak too loudly in a space where so many last breaths were taken. Some kneel beside her grave, tracing the letters on the marble with trembling fingers, whispering her name as if it were a prayer. Others stand in silence, lost in thought, feeling the strange pull of empathy across 500 years. The flowers on her stone change with the season's roses in summer, lilies in winter, but the message is always the same: she is not forgotten. There are nights when the tower feels almost alive, when fog drifts low over the Thames and the ancient walls seem to breathe. The guards who walk their rounds speak of a chill that moves before them, a whisper that follows their steps. They say it is not a haunting, but a presence, a reminder that this place was once soaked in the price of change. Some claim to have seen her figure gliding through the mist, not headless, but whole, her face serene, her eyes open. She does not scream or weep. She simply walks, as if making sure that the world she died for still remembers what she gave. And perhaps that is the truest ghost of all. Not a spirit trapped between worlds, but a memory so strong that it refuses to be anything less than alive. What makes her story endure is not the sword, nor the scandal, but the defiance that outlasted both. Anne Boleyn did not invent rebellion, but she embodied it in a time when women were meant to kneel and obey. She turned her intelligence into her weapon, her charm into her shield, and her death into her statement. Even stripped of her title, her body, her voice, she carved her name into history with the sharpest tool of all courage. That courage, impossible to measure, impossible to kill, is what keeps her alive now. When people say her name, they are not remembering a victim, they are invoking a survivor. And so the story continues, rippling outward like a stone dropped into a still pond. The centuries blur, but her eyes remain bright, watching, unyielding. Kings and kingdoms have fallen. Languages have changed. The very world has reinvented itself. Yet Anne Boleyn remains. The grass on Tower Green still grows thick and dark over the place where she fell. And somewhere beneath that earth, the echo of her heartbeat still thrums. You can almost hear it, if you stand very still, the steady rhythm of a life that refused to end. The quiet defiance of a woman who became more powerful in death than she ever was in life. And maybe that is the true miracle of Anne Boleyn. that the woman who lost her head became the one history could never silence. There is a kind of immortality that does not come from bloodlines or marble statues, but from the way a name refuses to die in the mouth of the living. Anne Boleyn has lived that way for half a millennium, half in the world of fact, half in the world of dreams, moving between the two like a flame that refuses to go out. Even now, her shadow stretches across every story England tells about itself. You can find her in the hymns of the church she helped create, in the faces of queens who came after her, in the way a nation still trembles when it remembers how easily a crown can become a weapon. Her death may have ended her body, but her defiance has outlasted empires. The truth is that England never truly buried her. It tried through silence, through shame, through centuries of careful forgetting, but her name kept rising like smoke through the cracks of history. Every scholar who opened the archives, every artist who painted her portrait, every woman who looked at her story and saw herself in it, each of them called her back. She has become something larger than any single version of her could contain: the saint, the seductress, the reformer, the rebel, the ghost who will not rest. All of them are true, and none of them are enough. For every attempt to define her, there is another Anne waiting beneath it, laughing softly in the dark. In modern England, her face is everywhere, though few realize how much of what they worship in her is really what they fear. There are documentaries that reconstruct her execution with forensic precision, books that imagine her secret thoughts, films that give her the voice she was denied. Her story has been translated into dozens of languages. Her portraits printed on postcards and scarves. Her name trending online every May as if the anniversary of her death were still breaking news. She is no longer just history, she is culture, woven into the fabric of the collective imagination. Yet beneath the glitter of fascination lies a wound that never healed: the uneasy truth that her death was not just an execution but an act of erasure. A message to every woman who dared to challenge the order of things. That message did not age well. The world she died in has changed beyond recognition. But the struggle that defined her has not. The questions she embodied: what happens when a woman's intelligence is mistaken for ambition, when her confidence is mistaken for arrogance, when her love becomes the ruin of her still echo today. That is why people still whisper her name, because her story is not only a mirror of the past, it is a warning for the present. She is not a ghost to fear, but a ghost to learn from. Each time a woman refuses to apologize for her power, each time a voice rises where silence was demanded, Anne walks again. Historians have tried to measure her influence as if it were a number. How many monasteries closed because of her? How many laws changed? How many lives were lost because a king fell in love? But influence cannot be measured in records or ruins. It lives in the way people think, in the spaces they dare to occupy. The church Henry built to justify his desire has long since evolved beyond his control, but Anne's shadow still lingers in its foundations. The England she helped create has forgotten the prayers she whispered, but it still speaks the language she helped set free. Her legacy is not in the ashes of power, but in the fact that centuries later, the world still wants to know her. And yet, for all the fascination, there is tenderness too. When visitors come to the tower now, they do not see a villain. They see a woman kneeling beneath the weight of destiny. A queen who faced her death with more grace than the world ever showed her in life. Children leave wildflowers on her grave. Tourists kneel and cry, not out of pity, but out of recognition, as if they have found in her some ancient echo of themselves. She has become, in her strange afterlife, a place where human frailty and strength meet. She reminds us that even those who fall are capable of rewriting the sky they fall beneath. Sometimes, when the tower closes for the night and the last light fades across the Thames, a breeze moves through the grass on Tower Green. The guards say it's just the wind, but it feels like more than that. It feels like memory itself breathing, stretching, settling in for another century of remembrance. If you stand there long enough, the city around you seems to disappear, the noise fading until all that's left is the soft sound of your own heartbeat and the whisper of a voice too quiet to be real. Perhaps it is imagination, perhaps something older. You can almost hear her say what she could not say on that morning, in 1536, that she was not afraid, that she was not defeated, that she would still be here when all her judges were dust. There are nights when London feels older than time, when the moon floats low over the river and the cobblestones shine like wet bone. On those nights, the past and the present blur. Somewhere within that blur, you can picture her, the curve of her face illuminated by moonlight, the calm in her eyes that never faltered, the faint smile of a woman who knew that death was not the end. She does not linger as a phantom chained to grief, but as something stronger, a witness, a guardian of her own truth. The air feels heavier where she once walked, as if it still carries the weight of everything she changed. And maybe that is what immortality really is, not being remembered perfectly, but being remembered endlessly. Anne Boleyn will never be whole again. Not in the way history demands. Too many hands have shaped her. Too many voices have rewritten her story. But perhaps that is the point. She has become part of everyone who tells her story. Part of everyone who refuses to look away from injustice cloaked as law. Her execution was meant to silence her. Yet her silence became a roar that never stopped echoing. When you leave the Tower and step out into the hum of modern London, it is hard to shake the feeling that she is walking beside you. Maybe not in the ghostly sense, but in the quiet awareness that she is still here, alive in the city that once condemned her. The wind off the Thames carries a chill that feels like her breath, and the lights reflected in the water tremble like candles in a chapel long ago, somewhere far below the streets. Beneath the stones and centuries lies the woman who changed everything, and above her, life goes on, noisy and bright, unaware that it owes her part of its freedom. That is the true ending of Anne Boleyn's story, an ending that is not an ending at all. She lives in the persistence of her name, in the restless pulse of a world still learning to listen to the voices it tried to silence. She lives every time someone asks why she died, and refuses to accept the answer. She lives because the truth, once spoken, cannot be buried. Her body may rest beneath a small marble stone, but her defiance breathes through history itself. Untouched, undefeated, eternal. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it, the steady rhythm of her heart beating through the centuries. Strong as ever, whispering the words that outlasted her execution, the words that made her immortal. I am still here.